where you can say it like it is and you're going to get honest feedback.
He just phenomenal athlete. It feels like he still has that lunch pail mentality a little bit.
What does it take to leave John McEnroe speechless? Sinner's Paris collapse. That is all it took. McEnroe, the man who watched Federer, Nadal, and Djokovic build entire dynasties, stared at that court on May 28th and said nothing. Because what that collapse made him realize is something the entire tennis world is refusing to accept. Sinner is now hungrier than any player he has ever seen. McEnroe said it, out loud, on record, and then went completely speechless at what that means for Wimbledon. This is not a coincidence. 10 days before Paris, Sinner vomited on court in Rome, drank pickle juice, and still won the title. In January, he crawled through the Australian Open third round and walked away champion. Sinner does not just survive these moments, he converts them into something scarier. That is exactly what McEnroe saw. Not a broken player, a dangerous one. And McEnroe has never used the word hungrier after a collapse for anyone. Not Federer, not Nadal, not Djokovic. Subscribe right now. Because what McEnroe said next should genuinely frighten every player at Wimbledon. Let's get into what McEnroe said word for word and why it changes everything. John McEnroe spoke to Tennis 365 at a TNT Sports event shortly after the match. He was asked directly whether Andre Agassi was right. Agassi had already gone on live television and said Sinner had a preparation flaw, a hydration problem, something correctable that his team had simply failed to fix. Agassi used the word inexcusable. He said there was no excuse for the best player in the world to hit a wall at an hour and 45 minutes. He said he personally drank 10 to 12 liters of water in the 24 hours before any extreme heat match. He maintained a 4-to-1 ratio of protein to carbohydrates. He said Sinner's team needed to bring somebody in, that this was not a fitness issue, that the fitness was never the question, the preparation was. McEnroe heard all of it. Then he said something that nobody expected. He said this is not a new issue. He said Sinner has had trouble with this for a couple of years, 3 or 4 different occasions where he cramped up badly enough to affect the outcome of a match. And then McEnroe said the thing that separates his reading from Agassi's entirely. He said in his opinion it is in Sinner's head a little bit. He said it is hard to deal with that and remain calm. He pointed at Carlos Alcaraz, who cramped against Zverev at the Australian Open earlier this year, and noted that Alcaraz recovered, same heat, same conditions, different outcome. Not because Alcaraz had better hydration, because Alcaraz found something mentally that Sinner, in that specific moment in Paris, could not locate. That distinction matters more than anything Agassi said, because Agassi's diagnosis is fixable with a protocol. You hire a sports scientist, you adjust the intake, you follow a formula. McEnroe's diagnosis is far more complicated, and far more interesting, because if the problem lives partly in the mind, then the solution is not a liter of water. It is a different kind of reckoning entirely. Now here is where the story gets uncomfortable for everyone who wrote Sinner off after Paris. In October 2025, after retiring from his third-round match at the Shanghai Masters against Talon Griekspoor, a match where he needed assistance just to leave the court, where his body shut down so completely that he could barely walk, Sinner sat in front of the media and said something remarkable. He said the cramps in Shanghai were due to a mental factor. He said the mistake was his. He did not deflect. He did not point at the scheduling or the humidity or the surface. He identified the source himself in his own language, voluntarily, without being pushed into it. That admission did not make a single major headline. Think about what that means. The #1 player in the world publicly identified a psychological component to his most recurring physical vulnerability, and the tennis media moved on by the next morning. Nobody connected it to the Australian Open cramping episode in January. Nobody connected it to the Rome incident in May. Nobody connected it to Paris. The dots were sitting there in plain sight for 8 months, and the entire industry looked straight past them. McEnroe did not look past them. When he called this a head issue, he was not guessing. He was reading a pattern that Sinner himself had already confirmed in October. The body was never the problem in isolation. Something upstream of the body. The anticipation of cramping, the awareness of the heat building, the memory of Shanghai and Wimbledon 2024 and every other time it has happened was triggering a cascade that no amount of pickle juice could stop once it started. And here is the part that makes Sinner genuinely frightening going into Wimbledon. He knows it too. A player who does not understand his own vulnerability cannot fix it. A player who identifies it specifically, calls it a mental factor, takes personal ownership without excuse, and then goes back out and wins 3 consecutive Masters 1000 titles on clay, Monte Carlo, Madrid, and Rome. Without dropping the mental thread is not a player in decline. He is a player in the middle of solving the hardest problem in professional sport. The problem of the mind under extreme physical stress. The Paris collapse did not reveal a weakness that was new. It revealed one that Sinner was already working on. The difference between Shanghai in October and Paris in May is not that the problem got worse. It is that Paris happened on the biggest stage, with the career Grand Slam within 1 game of his grasp, with the entire world watching, with odds so short that his pre-match probability of losing stood at roughly 1%. The pressure in that specific moment was unlike anything he had faced before. Not because he is fragile, because he is human. Now consider what Alcaraz was doing while all of this unfolded. The 2-time defending French Open champion pulled out of Roland Garros entirely with a wrist injury. He is also skipping Wimbledon. The man who beat Sinner in the longest French Open final in history, 5 hours and 29 minutes, the second longest Grand Slam final ever played, is sitting at home watching Sinner navigate the hardest psychological period of his career without being able to do anything about it. Without being on the court to capitalize. Without being there to apply the pressure that only Alcaraz knows how to apply against Sinner specifically. Their head-to-head stands at 8 wins for Alcaraz, 4 for Sinner. Every meaningful match they have played has gone to 5 sets or been decided by a tiebreak. Alcaraz has a 12-1 career record in 5th sets. Sinner's record in matches lasting over 3 hours and 50 minutes stands at 0 wins and 6 losses. Those numbers are real. They are documented, and they are the exact reason why what happens to Sinner mentally between now and Wimbledon matters more than any grass court warm-up event he is skipping. Because the version of Sinner that arrives at the All England Club on June 29th is not the same version that walked off court Philippe Chatrier on May 28th. The Paris collapse stripped something away, but what it stripped away was not confidence, it was not form. The clay court record going into Paris was 18 consecutive wins, 3 Masters titles, a 30-match winning streak across all surfaces. That form did not evaporate because of one afternoon in the heat. What the collapse stripped away was the last remaining layer of comfort, the assumption that the body would hold when the moment demanded it most. That assumption is now gone, and when an assumption disappears in a champion, one of 2 things happens. Either the absence of it becomes a permanent anxiety, a weight they carry into every big match, checking the temperature before every warm-up, wondering whether today is the day the wall arrives again. Or the absence of it becomes fuel, a specific, targeted, grinding obsession with fixing the one thing that cost them the biggest prize they had not yet won. McEnroe has watched both outcomes happen across 50 years of professional tennis. He has watched champions fold under the weight of their own vulnerability. He watched it happen to players with more natural talent than most people alive. He also watched the ones who converted the worst moment of their career into the defining motivation of everything that came after. He said Sinner is the second kind. He said the Paris collapse made Sinner hungrier than any player he has ever seen. That word, hungrier, is not a generic compliment. It is a specific psychological assessment from a man who competed at the highest level for 2 decades. Who knows the difference between a player who is motivated and a player who is genuinely transformed by a loss. McEnroe lost to Ivan Lendl in the 1984 French Open final after leading by 2 sets. He knows what that specific kind of loss does to a person. He lived it. He said later it affected him for years, not because he was weak, because it mattered that much. Sinner's Paris collapse mattered that much. The career Grand Slam was 1 game away. The draw had opened up completely with Alcaraz absent. The conditions were brutal but not unprecedented. The temperature reached 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot by any standard, but within the range Sinner had navigated before, including in Rome just 10 days earlier, where he vomited on court and still lifted the trophy. Everything pointed to Sinner closing it out. Everything except the thing McEnroe identified and Sinner himself had already named 8 months earlier: the mind. Now Sinner has 3 weeks of silence before Wimbledon. No Halley, no warm-up events, no matches, just practice, recovery, and whatever work he and his team are doing behind closed doors to address the one vulnerability that Paris made impossible to ignore. He will arrive at the All England Club as the defending champion. He will arrive without Alcaraz in the draw to threaten him from the opposite half. He will arrive with a motivation that no scheduling decision, no clay court title, no ranking point total could have manufactured artificially. He will arrive hungrier than any player John McEnroe has ever seen walk into a Grand Slam. That is not a prediction, that is a direct quote from the most credible voice in the commentary box. A man who has no reason to exaggerate, no channel to promote, no narrative to sell. A man who simply watched what happened in Paris and said what he saw with the precision of someone who has spent his entire life reading what tennis does to people at the edge of their limits. The tennis world spent the week after Paris debating hydration protocols and scheduling decisions and whether Sinner's medical timeout in the third set was technically legal under ATP rules. Medvedev raised the same question in Rome. The umpire allowed it. The debate continued. Meanwhile, the actual story, the one McEnroe told quietly in a single interview that most outlets buried under the Agassi controversy, sat waiting for someone to take it seriously. Sinner is not broken. He is not in crisis. He is not a cautionary tale about the dangers of an overloaded calendar or a flawed pre-match hydration routine. He is a 24-year-old with 4 Grand Slam titles, a 30-match winning streak that ended in the worst possible circumstances, and a self-awareness about his own psychological vulnerability that most champions never develop publicly, let alone this early. McEnroe went speechless because he recognized something rare. The collapse in Paris was not the end of Sinner's story at Roland Garros. It was the beginning of a version of Sinner that the rest of the tour should be studying closely. A version built not on comfort or momentum or favorable draws, built on the specific, clarifying, irreversible knowledge of exactly what it feels like to be one game away from everything and watch it disappear. That knowledge does not make a champion cautious. It makes them dangerous. Wimbledon begins June 29th. The grass is ready, the draw is open, and somewhere in the 3 weeks of silence between Paris and London, Jannik Sinner is becoming the hungriest player John McEnroe has ever seen walk onto a tennis court. If you have watched this far, then you already know this channel does not do surface-level takes. We go into the data, the quotes, the pattern, and the psychology that every mainstream outlet skips past. If this gave you a different way of seeing what happened in Paris and what it means for what comes next, subscribe right now. Hit the bell, because the Wimbledon breakdown is coming and we are going to need you here for it. This story is not finished. It is just getting started.